Hello everybody and welcome to another Top 5 board gaming video. Today I'm going to be doing one that's a little bit different in that this is more conceptual than anything else. Today I'm going to be talking about keeping your games pristine. Before I get started though, if you haven't done so already, please take a look at all my various social media pages as well as my Patreon page. On all those you'll be able to interact with myself as well as my channel in all sorts of fun and interesting ways. Getting right into today's conceptual thing. So I'm in the middle of moving and it's an absolute nightmare. If any of you guys who have relatively large game collections have ever moved, you know that it can be really difficult to do. So I thought it would be kind of interesting not only to get your guys' opinions about how to keep games pristine, but just in general what we can do to make sure that our games are cared for as best as we possibly can, because we all know that they're made of cardboard and they degrade gradually and all this kind of stuff. So what do you guys do to keep your games in good shape? I'm going to go through my personal ones. I hope that you enjoy this as always, and we're going to get started with my number 5. At number 5, I've got one that for me is specific to moving, and that is packing your games carefully. Now this can mean one of a couple of things that I've noticed, and the first is, for me personally, as I'm doing now, packing and moving my games. That is to say, putting my boxes into bigger boxes and then taking those bigger boxes and moving them to where they're going to be. In addition, you can look at this as packing up your original boxes with all of the games that you have in them. As an example for this, I have my favorite game of all time, Cosmic Encounter. Now you guys may not know this, but inside of this box I have the broken token insert that allows me to keep everything really nice and at least relatively good shape. So having inserts like this is great, and it can really help you with actually packing the game components within the game box itself. And I've got this one, I've also got the Tesla versus Edison one. So broken token and other types of inserts are great. On top of that, you want to look at things like miniatures. So something like Rising Sun, you can run into a lot of issues with getting the miniatures bent and all that kind of stuff if you don't pack them well. Again, for my purposes in this video, I'm talking about more of like long-term storage or moving and things like that. You want to make sure you have really good, big, sturdy boxes that your smaller game boxes are inside of, and to keep them in a good place and all this kind of thing, but we'll get into that in just a little bit. Overall, packing, and whether it's components or the games themselves in bigger boxes, is my number 5. At number 4, I've got another kind of unusual one, and that is very simply washing hands. This is something that I've talked about when I've talked about gamers that you don't want to play games with, and that is to say people who get like all of the various cheese dust or like chip dust and things like that on their fingers, or they just have like greasy snacks or something along those lines, and you don't want it on any of the cards or on the board or things of that nature. So I always like to make sure that my hands are nice and clean before I touch, whether it's my game or anybody else's. I want to respect the pieces and make sure that they stay as clean as possible. And this goes regardless of how somebody packs it, or what we'll talk about later on with like some of the other techniques that you can use inside of boxes. Honestly, it's just good manners, in my opinion, to make sure that you don't mess up other people's components. But at the same time, if it's your own game, then you do want to make certain that you don't get all of the nasty oil and dust and everything from your hands onto the cards and board. Now again, it's a little bit lower on the list because this is a little bit more hopefully common knowledge, but still I wanted to put it on this list. Number 4, keeping your hands clean. At number 3, I've got the very controversial sleeving of the cards. I use Cash and Guns as an example because not only is this one of the first games that I got, but when I first started collecting, I essentially sleeved every single game I purchased. So obviously this is the original, the first edition of this game, and the thing is I do have all of the cards sleeved. You can't tell too much. The problem is that these sleeves are terrible. I hate these sleeves. They're absolutely horrendous, but I still use them. I still have them, and honestly I'm debating taking all of these out of the sleeves, because like I said, this is something that, well, it's not controversial, that might be the wrong word for it, but at the same time it creates a lot of split decisions amongst gamers, because some people are obsessed about sleeving their games, other people don't really care, and now while I once was obsessed with sleeving my games, now I'm more of, if I play it that much that the cards are basically degrading, then that means I got my money's worth out of it type of thing. And the thing is, you can get really good expensive sleeves that do make your cards last, but I don't play collectible card games or anything along those lines. If anything, I'll still sleeve games that are very heavily card based. So for example, something like Welcome to the Dungeon, just as a random example. It's a really cheap game, but it's one that might be worth sleeving just because the entire game is based off of cards. And that way you can carry it around a lot easier and stuff like that. So for me personally, I've gotten to the point where if a board game has a lot of other aspects besides just cards, I really don't care. And on top of that, if it's one that I know isn't going to hit the table very often, I never bother with sleeves. But for certain games where it's important to keep the cards intact, they're really central to the entire game, or especially for games where you need to make certain that you have mysterious backs of the cards and things like that, for something like Werewolf, I do find that it works reasonably well. But this one I'm particularly curious what your guys' opinions are. Number 3, sleeving your cards. At number 2, I've got climate control. This may seem like something that's relatively obvious in our day and age, but it is extremely important. The fact is that games are made of cardboard. If cardboard is in a place that is hot and humid and nasty, the cardboard is going to get wet and it's going to break down, and that can absolutely ruin your games. So this goes back to what I was talking about with packing your games, and that's why potentially you can use like a big plastic footlocker as opposed to storing your smaller cardboard boxes into bigger cardboard boxes. Because if you put that into like a storage locker and the storage locker doesn't have climate control, you can be in really big trouble and it can ruin every single game you have. And it's really devastating, honestly. Again, it is high on the list because this can literally destroy your games without you even doing anything. But at the same time, climate control is relatively, at least, ubiquitous enough that most of us don't have to worry too much about it. If you're in a part of the world or the part of any country that does have to worry about this, like maybe you have inconsistent electricity or something along those lines, then it can be really difficult to do, and you just want to find a relatively cool and reasonably dry place to store your games, and that will at least keep them for as long as possible. But with that, climate control is my number 2. At number 1 for this, I have storage of your games in the place where they live, particularly talking about stacking games. You guys may remember before I got all of my fancy IKEA shelves here that I used to have the big giant metal utility shelves, and that's how I stored all my games. The problem is that I did take precautions to try and save them, but most of the time it didn't work. And while I didn't ruin any of my games, I did make some of them less pleasant, to say the least, or to put it mildly. Essentially, the problem that I ended up with is by stacking games on top of each other, you have all the weight pressing down, and on the shelves that I used to have, they had little bars on the ends that stuck up a little bit, so whenever a game was resting on top of that, all of the weight from the top was on that bar, so I got little indentations in the bottom of the cardboard. It's not a deal breaker, it's not absolutely horrible, but at the same time, this video is about keeping your games as pristine as possible. So now you can see, instead of doing that, I have minimal stacking up on the top of the shelves, but then by and large everything is stored like books, where there's nothing on top of them, and while the components inside might be shuffling around a little bit, they're not going to be getting mass from the top and essentially crushing the cardboard, which is something that can actually absolutely brutalize games. And again, just like with climate control, this is something that can happen with literally without you doing anything, because that's the issue, is you're not doing anything to stop it. With climate control, at least, you may not have a choice with it, but certainly with storing your games and actually stacking or not stacking your games, more importantly, it is something that you have more control over, so that's why it's number 1. And this is really a great way to make sure that you maintain stuff. Just like you can maintain books in the same way, if you keep them up on a bookshelf like this, then they will be much better off. But with that, storing your games, or rather not stacking your games on top of one another specifically, is my number 1. Well, folks, that's going to be it for me. I hope that you enjoyed this video on my top 5 ways of keeping your game collection pristine. Now, again, this is a little bit specific for me because I am in the middle of moving all of my games, so I was looking at it in part in that context, but also in a long-term context as well. And so, as always, I'm really curious what you guys have to say about this. How do you guys store your games, and do you take any particular precautions? Do you only take particular precautions for really expensive games, or games that you know are more vulnerable to having like miniatures bend or break, or cards that are handled more than normal, and all of that kind of stuff? You guys know that I love hearing from you, and this is especially a really interesting, more discussion topic than anything else. But either way, you guys know I love hearing from you, so please put any and all thoughts in the comments below. And with that, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.